Okay, so I'm speaking to you about understanding psoriasis genetics and implications for patient management. And I'll say right from the get-go that I am not a geneticist. I am a clinical dermatologist. I do work very closely with geneticists, but this is definitely a clinician's view of where we are in our understanding of genetics, and with a particular focus on where those findings have brought us in terms of changes to patient management. And I've got this talk in two bits. So there's a recorded bit, which is now part one, and then I'm speaking live straight after that. And I thought in the first part of the talk, I would give an overview of what's known about the genetics of psoriasis, and perhaps also the more exciting thing now going forward is where we're going and what the opportunities are with respect to future research. So just to pull it back to the patient, because I am a clinician, these are the key questions that people with psoriasis or the relatives or public health bodies are asking in, am I going to get psoriasis? How bad will it be? And can you treat it? And these questions on an individual level relate to these three key areas, and the opportunity is around how genetics might help us advance our understanding around disease susceptibility, disease prognosis, provide opportunity to identify new drug targets, and also identify determinants of whether or not individuals are going to respond to those drugs, and in particular the opportunity to try and identify those who've gone into disease remission. So just a quick word first about psoriasis itself, particularly for the non-clinicians in the audience. Why is it an important disease? And it is, first of all, a common disease. So most of this talk relates to what's called ordinary psoriasis or plaque psoriasis. And there's been a very comprehensive review around the epidemiology of psoriasis published in the BMJ this year by the Global Psoriasis Atlas, pulling together all the information that's known. And on the left is a forest plot showing from the different regions, the prevalence of psoriasis according to the world regions. And then on the right, similar data really maps onto a world map. It depends on what sort of visuals you like. I prefer the one on the right. But essentially what we know is that there's a bimodal incidence. So the peaking occurs so-called early and late. So peaking around 39 years and then later between 50 and 70 years. The prevalence historically is said to be greater the further you are away from the equator. And in this study, they showed that the prevalence was particularly highest in high income countries. Overall, men and women are equally affected, although it's probable that women may develop their peak incidence a bit earlier than men. It is a chronic inflammatory skin condition characterized by red, scaly, thick plaques, which typically occur at extensor sites, but of course can occur anywhere in the body, from relatively minor areas to full body coverage, and is associated with nail disease. Here you can see various degrees of severity, from minor pitting through to really quite significant thickening of the nails, and this very typical thing called Kerbener phenomenon, where you get the psoriasis going into areas of scarring, and I'll come back to that in a bit. Around 30%, up to 30% of people have associated arthritis, which can be small joint, large joint, or axial. And then increasingly, it's recognized that there's a major multi-morbid burden, which contributes to the increase in all-cause mortality. Obesity in particular, which probably drives may drive these other comorbidities, is a very prominent, particularly in severe psoriasis, with up to 30 to 40% with major obesity. And in fact, this appears to be a major causal driver to psoriasis. Sarah Brown did this work here using Mendelian randomizations showing the relationship between obesity and psoriasis to be a causal driver. So hypertension, hyperlipidemia, diabetes, collectively forming metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease in common with many other chronic inflammatory conditions, and probably driving most of the increase in all-cause mortality. Predictable psychological burden associated with having a chronic stigmatizing skin disease. And then there are other associations with other immune-mediated diseases, particularly inflammatory bowel disease, where a number of the disease susceptibility loci identified for psoriasis are shared with those of inflammatory bowel disease, as well as other conditions, kidney and liver disease. And this recent systematic review looking at all-cause mortality also highlights that people with mild versus severe disease are at increased risk, which the prevalence of these morbidities are much more common in those with severe disease. So here you've got mild disease here with the point estimate here compared to severe. So this is an important disease and affecting estimates of around 125 million people across the world. And just a brief note about pustular psoriasis, because genetically it's very distinct to that of plaque psoriasis. This is again a highly stigmatizing condition, but it is rare. And it ranges from having localized pustular eruptions on the hands through to the very rare generalized pustular psoriasis, which is a major systemic upset and associated with documented mortality. So genetics, what do we know and where did it start? So Lomholt was the first to document the prevalence of psoriasis and make the observation that the prevalence was higher in first degree and second degree relatives here. So he spent a lot of time knocking on doors around the Faroe Islands and the immediate area, and he was the first. And then subsequently twin studies identified that this was genetically determined, with around estimates, depending on which you look at, between 60 and 75% heritability. So where are we now with ordinary psoriasis or plaque psoriasis or psoriasis? That's generally how it's referred to in the literature. And more than 60 disease susceptibility loci have been identified, mainly in Caucasian cohorts. And these data are below this Manhattan plot is based on the most recent published large-scale GWAS, which involved 39,000 people with psoriasis. In fact, this study was inflated significantly by data from 23andMe, probably I think about 16,000 patients or self-reported psoriasis cases. And overall, the risk strongly correlates inversely with age of onset, which makes sense. And in common, again, with many complex common trait diseases, the disease susceptibility loci individually have a small impact, but collectively have had a profound impact on understanding the underlying disease pathogenesis. And to date, the estimate is that we have understood around 28% of the heritability of the disease. And again, in common with many common diseases, most of the studies have been in Caucasian populations, some Chinese, and there is significant overlap in a number of loci, particularly those with best or highest odds ratios. There is actually, Nick Dand at King's is leading a large update on this meta-analysis involving the cohorts and collaborators in this publication, as well as a number of other cohorts. So collectively we'll have 39,000 dermatology or healthcare diagnosed psoriasis patients, so not using the 23andMe. So we expect this to have a significant additional power. We hope to identify additional loci of interest. So just a few words on the specific or where are we in understanding these loci in terms of causal variants? Well, the first source one was in fact identified with linkage studies and is the major genetic determinant of psoriasis here. This is this peak said to increase the risk of psoriasis some 5-fold, and probably explaining up to 50% of disease heritability. So that's more than all the other loci put together. And it's a common, so around 50% of psoriasis cohort are HLA-C0602 positive. And careful mapping of source one does seem to indicate that HLA-C0602 is the most likely causal susceptibility allele. There are other signals in this region, including HLA-B and also corneodesmin, but HLA-C is the major driver to that signal. And interestingly, it does seem to associate with particular characteristics. So early onset, guttate psoriasis, which is this form of psoriasis that is typically triggered by infection due to streptococcal infection, and also associated with this condition I mentioned earlier, the Koebner phenomenon. And this HLA-C is also interesting because it seems to demonstrate this interaction with ERAP1. And ERAP1 is the endoplasmic reticulum aminopeptidase 1, codes for this enzyme that essentially trims peptide antigens to their optimal size so they can bind to the MHC class 1 molecule. So you can see here on the left, this is the data from the psoriasis study, which was first published in 2010, showing the odds ratio compared to inheriting one of these variants significantly increases the risk of disease. And the same interaction with HLA and ERAP1 is seen in ankylosing spondylitis, a different HLA allele, but nevertheless the same sort of principle, strongly highlighting the role of antigen presentation in disease pathogenesis and adaptive immunity. So where does this all come together? All of these genetic associations or disease susceptibility loci all coalesce around key molecular and cellular pathways that seem likely or have been confirmed as having core roles in the disease pathogenesis of psoriasis. And it is certainly true that the advent of targeted biologic therapy that targets some of these key pathways, which I'll talk about shortly, really have sort of validated these targets or indicated that they are indeed highly relevant to the disease pathogenesis. And so broadly, they fall into these key areas here. And this summary review written by Nick Dand, I recommend reading, because it's a very good detailed update on what we know about the genetics of psoriasis. And this figure is from there. And so essentially, there are candidate causal genes detailed here around skin barrier function, type 1 interferon signaling, the IL-23, IL-17 axis, antigen presentation, as I've said, and then the IL-17 and type 1 interferon both driving NF-kappa B signaling. And so putting this sort of together in this cartoon, the current thinking about the disease pathogenesis, which, as I say, has been driven by genetic discovery as well as major other research, suggests that following an initial insult at the leading to keratinocyte damage with release of self-nucleotides which bind to AMPs, and this leads to stimulation of plasmacytoid dendritic cells, which seem to be key initiators in psoriasis. And this PDCs then lead to marked type 1 interferon upregulated signaling and driving myeloid dendritic cell stimulation, and so on to this stimulation and proliferation of Th17 and Th type 1 cells, leading to this archetypal mediator IL-17. That's why the IL-17 monoclonal antibodies have therapeutically been incredibly effective, as have those blocking this pathway here, IL-12, 23. The putative antigen here is still remains to be completely confirmed. LL37 is one, but there are others that have been suggested. But this essentially gives rise to CD8 T cell clonal expansion. And overall, all of this recruitment and chemokine and cytokine release leads to keratinocyte proliferation, recruitment of additional inflammatory cells, thickening of the epidermis and vascular proliferation, which drives the clinical phenotype. A note about pustular psoriasis. As mentioned, this has got a very distinct genetic basis. It's clinically distinct and perhaps not surprisingly genetically distinct. And some years ago, both a French group with Hervé Bachelet, was the clinical dermatologist involved, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, as well as ourselves, identified these mutations in the IL-36RN gene in generalized pustular psoriasis, which is a sort of acute severe form. And this gene encodes IL-36 receptor antagonist, which is essentially a brake on IL-36 signaling. And the mutation leads to aberrant IL-36 RA, so it doesn't function, and then you get unregulated, unstopped IL-36 signaling, and then massive release of these pro-inflammatory cytokines. And subsequent to that, there have been a couple of other mutations, AP1S3, which and also CARD14, both of which converge on this same pathway, leading to upregulation of IL-1, but IL-36 in particular. And this study here, which came from Francesca Capon's group, identifies the differential features based on how many IL-36RN alleles are being carried, and also looks at how common those different mutations are depending on the clinical phenotype. So there's a lot of work to do in this area because we've only identified these 3 mutations and they're rare even in these pustular phenotypes. So really the genetic basis of pustular psoriasis, although this pathway seems to be important, remains to be properly further investigated. So in summary, in terms of what we know about the genetics of psoriasis and where we should be going, and this relates to these questions that we asked at the beginning. In terms of disease susceptibility, the genetic architecture of psoriasis is understood to a great extent, or a reasonable extent, in terms of heritability. As I said at the beginning, around 28%. That does mean that there's a fair amount still to be found. But in terms of genetic determinants of disease prognosis, in fact, very, very little has been done in that area. The phenotyping of these large-scale cohorts to date hasn't really been of high enough quality, and we haven't had the data set sufficient to look at it. And in terms of treatments, well, as mentioned, that there has been major drug discovery around psoriasis, which I'll talk about in a minute, but identification of determinants of response and remission, again, largely uncharted yet to date. And actually, these 2 key areas are a major focus of research for the next 3 to 4 years as part of this European consortium, which aims to bring together all of the different cohorts in order to address those specific questions around determinants of disease prognosis and treatment response.